Hello everyone and welcome back to another Kerbal Space Program video, and in today's Kerbal Space Program video we're going to be looking around the latest version of the game, version 1.11, some assembly required, which of course released earlier this week. Now the update added quite a few nifty little features, but one of my favourite additions is that we now have really high quality surface textures for Vall, Pol, Bop and Tylo, which of course are all moons of Jool. The last remaining moon, Laythe, has already had a texture upgrade, as has Jool itself. So we now have a complete finished revamp of the Julian system. Every single Jool moon, and again Jool itself, now has a much higher surface texture than what they originally had. So I thought to celebrate this, we would do a Jool 5 mission. Now, for those unaware, the Jool 5 is a mission concept in Kerbal Space Program in which you have to visit every single moon of Jool. And, you know, traditionally this would involve the caveat of no refueling or mining either, although I guess that's not really like, it's not like a legally binding clause, right? Like you could do whatever you want. But I thought I'd put a spin on the old Jool 5 mission, because I've done a couple in the past. I've done one, I did one in like 2016 that wasn't very good. I wasn't that good at the game at that point. I just sort of winged it, and the craft was very inefficient. The flight was very inefficient. It just wasn't a very good video in retrospect. But then, you know, I got a little bit better at the game, and in 2018, I believe it was, I did a fully reusable Jool 5 mission in which I sent an SSTO to the Jool system that then deployed lots of, you know, smaller single stage landers that went to all the moons and returned without dropping a single stage. The entire vessel was recovered. The only thing expended was fuel. So I thought, how can I sort of, I don't know, challenge myself or put a new twist on the formula this time around? And I thought, well, you know, it's all well and good doing a minimalist Jool 5 mission, but those tend to be all the rage. A lot of people have done minimalist Jool 5s at this point. And, you know, if you're doing a Jool 5, you're going to be going to lots of different destinations. There's loads of opportunities to bring science experiments. So rather than do a super lightweight Jool mission, why not do a super heavyweight Jool mission? Yeah, we're going to be landing on every single moon of Jool and bringing every single science experiment along with us. The aim of this mission is to maximize our scientific output. And, you know, why not do it in style? So not only is this a very practical vessel because it has all of these science experiments in the game, but it also looks very cool in my humble opinion. So we've kind of built the spine of the craft using those interstage structures of the fairing plates, and then the front of it is like a big mothership, because Jool 5 missions, well, I guess any Jool mission now I think about it, is going to be very long in duration. So it'd be nice to have some space for the Kerbals to move around. So we've got that big anterior section at the front, which has got a big cockpit, and two side passenger cabins, which in my head canon contain cryogenic storage so that the Kerbals can sit in suspended animation for the long interplanetary voyage to the green planet, so it's not, you know, horribly boring for them. And then we also have a re-entry module right at the front, just because this ship obviously doesn't like lend itself particularly well to re-entry. So we've got a dedicated re-entry module that'll safely get the Kerbals back to Kerbin, with of course the rest of the ship being expended and destroyed in the atmosphere. And the ascension stage itself, I don't know, I wouldn't say I'm not proud of it, but there's nothing really to write home about, is it? It's just it's just one big stack using the making history parts. Fairly simple as boosters go. And there it is on the launch pad. We're throttling up those engines before releasing the launch clamps, and that's actually a feature of this update that I really like that might go under some people's radar, and that is that launch clamps now, when you add them to a vessel, automatically get added to the first stage of the staging window. So you no longer have to mess around moving the launch clamps down to the first stage so that, you know, when you press space, your rocket doesn't remain anchored to the ground. Kind of a bad example in this mission's case because I didn't actually add them to the first stage, but it's nice that they're just all there. It's much easier to sort things through. And in a similar vein to that, I believe parachutes are no longer automatically added to the first stages either. I think they're always added to a top stage, I think. I need to read the patch notes again, I've forgotten. Anyway, I'm going to, whilst we're still fairly early on in the video, I think it's only like 4 minutes, 40 seconds-ish into the video, so we've still got time. If you've seen the length of this video and are like a bit intimidated by it, then I have actually made a shorthand version of this video. It's like a music video. That's linked in the description, and it's not monetizable because I used copyrighted music. So all of the revenue from that video goes to the record label. So sorry if there's like a really annoying mid-run ad placement or anything like that. I have no power over the ads in that video. Hopefully they're fairly sparing and minimalist. But yes, I'm not. If you think, oh, he's just trying to get more clicks on another video, worry not. I can't make any money off that video. So if anything, I should be discouraging you from watching it. But I'm just saying, I like making music videos from time to time, and I think the music video came out quite nicely. So if you'd like to watch a more abridged version of this mission, then that's always an option in the video description. And here we are circularizing just before we reach a stable orbit. I'm going to stage that Rhino engine because it doesn't have any means of deorbiting itself, and I don't want to leave it stuck in orbit, so that's why I ditched that stage just before we got our periapsis out of Kerbin's atmospheric level. And there we are making our maneuver node, getting a Jool encounter pretty easily because I launched at an optimal Jool transfer window, which for those of you who don't know, an optimal Jool transfer window would be if you were to draw a line from Kerbin to the sun to Jool. The angle that that line would form at the sun should be around 100 degrees. So basically like, I don't know, 5 to 3 on a clock. Anyway, the voyage to Jool is a very long one, and so it necessitates a very long escape burn from Kerbin, and we've only got 4 nuclear engines powering this thing, and we've got a very, very high dry mass and a very, very high wet mass as well, so, you know, our thrust-weight ratio is pretty poor. So I've actually split the burn into 3 parts. We've got 2 450-ish meter per second burns to get ourselves to the edge of Kerbin's sphere of influence, just beyond the height of Minmus, and then we'll do 1 final burn just to get ourselves to Jool. This means that we can make the absolute most of the O-berth effect, which states that you are most efficient when burning as close to periapsis as possible. So by splitting our burn over 3 shorter burns, we're spending more time burning at periapsis than we would be otherwise if we just did the entire thing in one go. So, you know, saving a little bit of fuel there. Now, at this point, we've pretty much exhausted all of the fuel in our first fuel tank stage. So what I'm going to do is time warp up to apoapsis now and then perform a small retrograde burn just to lower our periapsis to, you know, enter Kerbin's atmosphere and then stage that lower tank. This not only helps optimize the mass of our ship, because at this point, that tank is quite literally just dead weight, but by lowering our periapsis to be within the atmosphere of Kerbin, it means that that tank is not going to be left floating around in space forever. It's going to eventually have its orbit decay and it'll crash into the ocean or just get burned up upon atmospheric entry. So that's why I'm doing a short retrograde burn just here. Now, before we do our final burn to get to Jool, we quickly need to raise our periapsis again so that our ship does not meet a similar fate to the fuel tank we just ditched, and then we can replot that maneuver node that I somewhat over-enthusiastically plotted just there. So yeah, I just had to undo that little maneuver whilst we perform our prograde burn to get our periapsis at a more desirable height, and then we could quickly replot that maneuver node. But as before, it wasn't a big deal. It was pretty easy to do because, as I said earlier, we are at a Jool transfer window. So it was a fairly trivial matter of just dragging out that prograde marker on the maneuver node maker, and Robert your father's brother, we got our Jool encounter straight away. And now we begin the longest of the 3 escape burns to get ourselves all the way to Jool's height. Of course, we are going to have to do a mid-course correction burn because we're not on a great inclination here. We are going to pass by Jool a little bit too high or too low. I took a random guess and got it wrong, even though I think it's always the same every time when you burn. When you get a Jool encounter from Kerbin, you're always a little bit too low. You could do the inclination change from Kerbin's sphere of influence, but it's far more efficient to do it from interplanetary space, so that's why I didn't bother doing the inclination change on our initial escape burn. And as you can see, we're going for a Tylo gravity assist so that we can circularize at Jool for effectively 0 cost. Obviously, we're going to have to expend the small amount of Delta V to get that Tylo encounter, but it's very much negligible when you consider how much Delta V is required to perform a capture at Jool using conventional engine burning. Now that maneuver node is all plotted, we can just time warp up and get ready to execute it just under 100 meters per second of Delta V, which is a drop in the ocean for our overall budget. I do have the Delta V readouts on the top of the screen, that Kerbal Engineer readout, as well as the in-game readouts on the left-hand side where the staging windows are. It is a little bit misleading though, because this craft is fairly complicated. We've got several different types of engines. We of course have the nuclear engines, which are driving the entire mothership. These are the most efficient engines, but they only burn liquid fuel. We also have engines that burn both liquid fuel and oxidized. We've got aero spike and 4 spark engines, which all have different ISPs and therefore will have different Delta V readouts in the game. And then we've also got a Rapier engine on that space plane that's going to do our Laythe landing. So all of this kind of complicates the Delta V readout a little bit. So don't rely on it too much when trying to figure out how much fuel we've got remaining at any part in the mission. I mean, I guess the most reliable estimation is just to look at the resource gauge on the top right-hand corner of the screen. And now we begin to split the vessel up. We're going to take the front section with Jebediah on board to Laythe, and then the I guess the posterior section, that's going to go to Tylo and Vall, and then once it's at Vall, the two ships will dock with each other and the Kerbals can be reunited. I'm doing it this way because it's just a little bit more efficient to split the craft in two for the most difficult destinations in any Jool 5 mission. That is your Laythe landing and your Tylo landing. Both are very difficult moons in their own sort of different ways. I would say Tylo is probably the most challenging moon in the entire Julian system. Some people might argue that Laythe is the most difficult, and I would accept that argument. I wouldn't agree with it, but I would accept it. Laythe just requires a fair chunk of Delta V to get to because it's in a fairly low orbit around Jool, and it does take a fair amount of Delta V to ascend from its surface when you compare it to something like Pol or Bop. It has a very thick atmosphere as well, so you kind of need to rely, well, the easiest way of designing a Laythe lander is to create some sort of space plane. So in this case, I've got a small aircraft with a Rapier engine that's going to do the bulk of the ascension, but we've also got 2 spark engines just to provide some maneuverability when we're in the vacuum of space. We don't really need them, but it does increase our efficiency a little bit because those spark engines are much more efficient than the Rapier engine is in closed cycle mode. Of course, the trade-off being that they have terrible thrust-to-weight ratio compared to the Rapier engine. So as you can see, we made use of another Tylo gravity assist to lower our Jool orbit to be the height of Laythe and get ourselves on a Laythe encounter. I did mention that it takes a fair amount of Delta V to circularize at Laythe because it's sitting in a fairly low Jool orbit. However, we can make use of its atmosphere to do some aero braking to capture for a little bit less Delta V than if we were just going to circularize entirely on engine. So I'm actually going to do a slight combination of the two. We're going to do some aero braking and some deceleration via the nuclear engines to get our Laythe orbit. There it goes. I believe we're circularized. Nope, not quite yet. There goes our orbital line now, and then we can just swing around once more and do another aero brake just to lower our apoapsis a little bit, just because I wanted to basically get to a nice low Laythe orbit so that we could more easily aim our space plane at a specific landmass on the surface of the moon. Laythe is quite difficult to do landings on because, you know, the operative word of landing is land. There isn't much land on Laythe. It's mostly ocean. And it's often a little easier to predict where you're going to end up when you deorbit if you're coming in from a low Laythe orbit. And very specifically, in this case, I wanted to land on Lowne Island, which is where our Laythe outpost is currently sitting in my Life on Laythe series. And I wanted to aim here for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I've got a massive ego, but more importantly, is that we've got Jebediah flying this spaceship, which means we can only use the Mystery Goo and Science Junior experiments once before they can't be used again, because he is not a scientist Kerbal, he's a pilot Kerbal, so we can't restore those experiments. However, at the Laythe surface colony, there is a scientist there, so she could just come out and reset the experiments for us. We can run them again during our Laythe ascent. So that's kind of another reason why I'm aiming for that island. So here we are, just coasting through the air, bleeding off our speed. I think I deorbited myself a little bit too soon. We had quite a long glide to get to the island, but it was fine. I just held a fairly conservative angle of attack to make sure that our glide would be long enough to make sure that we would get all the way to Lowne Island without requiring the use of that Rapier engine to push us the last little leg of the journey. And there it is. We've got our target selected on the ground. I guess there's not much else to do other than just aim at that target and go there. I'm great at this whole commentary thing, aren't I? Now, in addition to the conventional Kerbal Space Program experiments, as in, you know, the experiment modules like your Science Juniors, your Mystery Goos, etc., etc., we've also got the brand new stuff that came with the 1.11 update. Specifically, in this case, is the EVA Science Pack. And let me just say, guys, it's absolutely adorable. It's now my new favorite thing to do when on EVA. Yes, even more so than planting a flag. This is great. And you guys are going to see what I mean. We're going to do it on every single planet. Not every single planet. Every single moon we visit in this mission. It's great. I won't say too much because I'll let you guys see what it is when we do it. I mean, at this point, you've probably watched other people's previews of the update, or in fact played it yourself, so this is probably not like some big suspenseful thing. You know exactly what's going to happen, but it's still, let me have this, guys. Hey, by the way, can you see the new style RCS block there with the 5th port? That was great. Thank you so much, squad. I've been wanting that forever, basically, that 5-port RCS block, so the great update. Thank you. But yes, we've planted our Lowne Aerospace flag. Jebediah is running all the various onboard science experiments. I'm sure our scientist Kerbal is ready to go on an EVA to come and meet Jeb and restore the Mystery Goo Containment Unit and the Science Junior. But now it's time to play a spot of golf. Yes! So yes, the Kerbals bring a golf club and a ball. And that's what they do now. Oh, isn't that cute? Now, I'm almost certain that this particular EVA science experiment is a nod to Alan Shepard of Apollo 14, who legendarily brought along a 6-iron golf club head, which he could attach to the handle of a lunar excavation tool, and 2 golf balls, and then subsequently took 2 shots on the surface of the moon. I imagine this was quite difficult due to the limited flexibility of the astronaut's EVA suit, but he did it nonetheless, and he will always be a legend in my book for that. And that's, I haven't got official confirmation of this, but let's be real, that's what inspired this particular EVA science experiment. But as you can see, our Laythe Surface Base resident scientist has now restored the Mystery Goo Containment Unit and Science Junior Experiment Bay, so Jebediah can now run those experiments again during his Laythe ascent. So here we are, we're going to set our mothership as our target, time warp around so that it's in a more desirable location for our launch, and then we can get to one of the most textbook takeoffs I've ever done. It's not a great runway surface, I'll give you, it's terrible. It's downhill for one. It's very lumpy and bumpy. It's not great. Now, this is stock textures. For the past few weeks, I've been using GamesLinks' amazing parallax mod, which adds tessellation to the ground, but I felt it would be better to uninstall this mod for this video because the main reason I'm doing this mission is to showcase the new stock surface textures of all the moons of Jool. Now, I've already shown the surface of Laythe in previous videos because, as stated earlier, Laythe received its texture revamp quite a while ago now, but the other moons have not, or had not, I should say, in the past tense, because of course they now have. Great commentating there, Matt. Thank you. Now, ascension on Laythe is pretty easy because its atmosphere is less dense than Kerbin's atmosphere, and there is less of it. It terminates at 50 kilometers above the surface rather than 70 kilometers, which is the case on Kerbin, which means that ascension is actually quite easy. You can be fairly aggressive with your space planes, and in fact, you don't actually need any oxidizer to get yourself out of Laythe's atmosphere. Obviously, you'll need some to circularize, unless you want to do some sort of, I don't know, decoupler boosting or something weird like that. I don't know why you would. But you don't need any oxidizer for your actual ascension. You only need the oxidizer to perform your circularization burn. Now, that being said, I think I did do some closed cycle burning with that Rapier engine just to kick my apoapsis height up that last little bit, but we really didn't need to. If I'd flown things a little bit more efficiently, I probably wouldn't have had to do that, but I was feeling a little bit lazy. We got a long mission ahead of us, guys. I just wanted to make things as simple as possible, and we've quite clearly got the Delta V to do a maneuver like that, so I wasn't really bothered about being hyper efficient at this point. And there we are once again in space. We can switch to the spark engines, which are a little bit more efficient than the closed cycle Rapier, and, you know, try and force that encounter node to be a little bit closer than what it currently is. So we have a separation of 0.8 kilometers, which is fairly, you know, respectable. So what I did was just made a maneuver node at our closest intersect point and just created a maneuver node to match our orbit with our target, not to actually follow, but just to see how many seconds it would take to execute that maneuver node, because by matching our orbit to our target, that's how you get a target rendezvous, basically. So I made that maneuver node to figure out how long it would take to do the burn, which in this case was 1 minute and 9 seconds. And so in order to kind of get the most efficient execution of that burn, you want to take that time, cut it in half. So in this case, that would be 34.5 seconds, quick maths. That's when you would start that deceleration burn. I think I overshot it a little bit actually, but it all worked out in the end. Once I'd done that burn and killed off all of my velocity relative to our target, I just pointed straight at the target on the nav ball, burned towards it, went to the map screen, and just watched that target separation indicator swing around to 0 kilometers, and then we could just coast towards the target. And right before we impacted it, pointed retrograde, could have all speed again, and then just, you know, tactically aimed the docking ports together, and it all worked out. I don't know why I'm necessarily commentating all of this, because you just saw it happen, and the on-screen visuals probably do a much better job of highlighting what it was I was trying to say. Now, we're going to get Jebediah back on board the mothership, but not before we remember to remove all the science from this spaceplane, because this spaceplane is not going to be coming with us. It has served its purpose. At this point, it would just be dead weight and reduce our delta V. So it's time to ditch it. There is a probe core on board that spaceplane, so we can make it deorbit itself and crash it into Laythe. But that would be a shame, you know? We have a functioning Laythe SSTO. Maybe this could be useful for life on Laythe. So instead of deorbiting it and destroying it, I'm actually going to maneuver it towards our Laythe base camp, my Laythe space station, where it might be able to serve as a useful addition to our life on Laythe expedition. Maybe as a, I don't know, as an escape pod for the space station, or as like an emergency Laythe dissension module, because at the moment I don't think we've got any means of getting from the space station down to the surface of Laythe. That'll be for the next installment of the Life on Laythe series, whenever that may be. But for now, you know, in case of any emergencies, we can get a Kerbal down to the surface nice and quickly, and then, or, you know, conversely, we could land this on the surface and bring a Kerbal back up to the space station. I know it's not got much fuel left, but as you can see, this space station has massive amounts of fuel there to refuel space planes, so we can fill the tanks up and it can continue to serve a useful life. But that's all for the future. Right now, it's still all in the future. Actually, I've got a time warp around to our next maneuver node, but we have crossfaded meanwhile to Bob and Bill aboard the Tylo ship, and I guess the Bop, Pol, and Vall lander as well, although we are going to reunite with Jebediah before doing any moons after Tylo. But for me, I'm getting flashbacks of when I was doing this mission. This was the most nerve-wracking part, because the Tylo lander, in my opinion, is the limiting factor of any Jool 5 mission. Tylo is the single hardest body to land on in the entire game. It's kind of the flip side of Eve. You know, Eve is considered the final boss by many players because it is the hardest planet to take off from. Tylo is the opposite, because it's relatively easy to take off from, but very, very difficult to land on. The reason for this is because it's massive. It's effectively the same size as Kerbin. It's slightly smaller, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same. But unlike Kerbin, it has no atmosphere. So imagine landing on Kerbin without an atmosphere. You can't use parachutes, and of course there is no atmospheric drag to slow yourself down. It's basically like the Mun on steroids. It takes an absolutely massive 2,270 meters per second to land on and take off from. That's both ways as well, so that's just one journey. So I'd say for a kind of a safe Tylo lander, you need a total of 5,000 meters per second of delta V, so you need a fairly beefy lander. And I said from the outset that I wanted this mission to not only just be a Jool 5, but also be a practical Jool 5, so the Kerbal landers themselves have like cockpits. It's not just a lawn chair on a fuel tank, and they're also going to have every single science experiment in the game, including in this case some of the new EVA science experiments, which means that the lander is very heavy. It's much heavier than a lot of, you know, typical Tylo landers. So that made things a little bit more difficult. But it worked in the end. I know I was saying earlier that at this point I was a bit nervous because I hadn't really tested this mission out. Like, I'd tested the Tylo lander and I'd tested the Laythe lander, but I'd never tested the entire ship in one go. I just sort of tested out the lander designs and then just built a mothership around the landers and reckoned, this is probably enough Delta V. Let's just do the mission, and I filmed it. And luckily, that's probably quite a risky way of doing things. I know a lot of my fellow YouTubers do a lot more meticulous planning than I do, but you guys, you only live once, 2020, you know, and I've got to get these videos out once a week, and I don't always have time to do extensive planning, so you just got to wing it sometimes. Is that a pun? Probably not. Let's continue. Now, this is a stock vessel. I do have those silver donut tanks on the top. Those are not modded parts. Those are just alternate colors for the donut tank. I don't actually know what that tank is called. Is it? It just appeared for a second, I think, but I'm not sure. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Now we can perform our deceleration burn. Now, you may have noticed that this thing does not have any landing legs, and that's because we're going to be landing on those silver fuel tanks. You can see at the bottom, they're like little stumpy legs that don't move. On the bottom of those fuel tanks, there are some grip pads to act as a sort of a grip point, I guess, to the surface, but at the moment they don't extend low enough because that massive aerospike engine is lower down, and that's because we're going to be ditching that aerospike right before we touch down on the surface. We need the aerospike for our descent because it has very good thrust to weight ratio to counteract the massive gravitational pull as we descend towards the surface. We won't need the aerospike's thrust for our ascent because our vessel will be much lighter because we'll have shed most of our fuel and we'll have removed a lot of the onboard experiments because we're going to set up like a little temporary surface base. I brought loads of the breaking ground science experiments with me to do lots of, I guess, surface research. And speaking of the surface, look at that. I mean, Tylo's surface revamp was the single most exciting thing for me. Tylo is one of my favorite places to visit in Kerbal Space Program because of the challenge it presents, but it's so ugly, or at least it was so ugly. But now it's I guess it's not that interesting, but it looks nice. Like, the texture is not blocky and blotchy and smudgy and horrible. So thank you very much, squad. I was very excited to see Tylo get the facelift it deserves. And look, we're planting some of the new lamps that came with the 1.11 update. I must say they look very nice. And we'll be deploying, like I said, the science experiments that come with the Breaking Ground DLC as well. So I'm not going to show the deployment of all of them because once you've seen one, you've seen them all. And hey, look! It's another EVA experiment, this time taking out a banana and smashing it with a hammer because, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, space is quite chilly, right? It's cardigan weather, definitely. So the banana freezes instantly and you can shatter it with a hammer. I don't think there's ever been a real-life experiment where someone took out a banana in the vacuum of space and then subsequently smashed it with a hammer or another kind of blunt object. But it's a very popular science experiment to demonstrate the effects of cold things such as liquid nitrogen. I feel like that's the one everyone's seen, where you freeze a banana with liquid nitrogen and then just smash it. That's what I remember seeing on, Brainiac probably did that when I was a child watching TV. But I don't think there's ever been a banana in space experiment. But I'm happy to be proved wrong because that sounds great. Whichever astronaut or cosmonaut, whoever did that, they're a hero. They're a hero. Anyway, there's a little shot of our ground base. Now we're just going to crossfade over to where we start thinking about our ascent. So I'm going to time warp around for our mothership to get to a more desirable location for our ascent. And then we can start thinking about taking off. Now, the Delta V is going to be very close. We've only just got enough Delta V to get to orbit. I know I said you need about 2,300 meters per second to deorbit or reorbit, but really, you know, that's dependent on a lot of variables. For example, flying in the most efficient way, which very few players do. So I usually try and budget around 2,500 meters per second rather than 2,300, just to provide a little bit more, just as a sort of reserve budget. And of course, it gives you a bit more fuel to do things like orbital rendezvous. So typically when I talk about Tylo landers, or, you know, when I'm designing Tylo landers, my usual recommendation is to try and engineer 5,000 meters per second into the vessel. That then is quite a safe number. for conducting these landings. Of course, you do have to consider your thrust to weight ratio. You can't land an ion craft on Tylo because the ion engine just can't overcome the surface gravity. But after that, I quite like the aero spike solution I used in this mission. There are probably much better things you could do, but this seems to work for me. And it's like that saying, isn't it? If it's stupid and it works, it ain't necessarily stupid. So as I said, I like to try and engineer 2,500 meters per second into our ascent stage. In this case, I think there was 2,900 meters per second, which then gave us, about 300 meters per second to do some orbital maneuvers to get a rendezvous with our mothership again. So obviously I didn't fly things especially efficiently because we've only got 182 meters per second remaining, but I'd say that's fine, right? It's all part of the budget, and hey, that's why we have quick saves, isn't it? So if you don't get things dead on, you can always try again. So 0.3 kilometer separation as our initial encounter I don't think is too bad at all. So we can just time warp up and get ready to kill off all of our velocity relative to our target. Oh, we can perform a magnometer boom experiment as well. I always forget about this piece in the game. I think this only came very recently, didn't it? In fact, I think that was the last update, the 1.10 update, where that was added. And of course, we can run our science experiments again. We have Bob coming with us, so he can reset the Mystery Goo and Science Junior unit, so no need to go looking for other Kerbals from different missions to come and restore things for us. He can go on EVA and just collect the data and, of course, reset those experiment bays. Now, at this point in the mission, like when I was filming this footage, I was positively thrilled. I was relieved because we have now done the two most difficult components of the Jool 5 mission, which is our Tylo landing and our Laythe landing. I know we've got to do our Tylo orbit rendezvous, but in terms of uncertainty over whether or not I can do this mission, we've pretty much now confirmed that the rest of this mission is going to be possible, basically. Okay, so now we're going to perform our docking. As you can see, I did a similar thing to what we did around Laythe, where I just got things as close as I really could, and then just killed off all of our speed relative to our target at that intersect point, pointed towards the target on the nav ball, and, rinse and repeat until we get to where we are today. So I kind of have to do this awkward thing because obviously that interstage node is in the way. So I kind of have to awkwardly maneuver the lander can around that truss structure to get to the internal docking port. And of course, you don't have monopropellant on this thing, so it does make things a little bit more difficult when trying to translate left and right. But with practice, it's fairly simple. I did use monopropellant for the Laythe space plane, to be fair, but for the Tylo lander, I really wanted to optimize our Delta V. Delta V isn't so much of an issue on Laythe because you don't really need any to perform the descent because you can just use the air and a parachute to land. And ascending from Laythe, you can just use air breathing engines, not a big deal. You can splash out your Delta V budget on things like monopropellants and stuff, but on Tylo we cannot afford such luxuries. Our budgets are a lot tighter, so that's why I didn't go with monopropellant to enable slightly more easier docking. I guess I could have put monopropellant ports on the mothership, but I don't know. I mean, you guys saw me do that docking procedure, right? It was fairly easy, just a little bit awkward is all. So at this point, I'm sure that Jebediah Kerman dearly misses Bob and Bill and vice versa as well. So it'd be nice to get our space frogs reunited. So let's do that at Vall. And Vall, I am actually really impressed with. I think Vall might be my favorite texture update for this update of KSP. It looks absolutely smashing. I will say nothing further. I won't spoil the surprise in case any of you watching haven't seen what Vall looks like yet, but let me just tell you guys, it looks stunning. Of course, before we can actually talk about Vall any further, we do still need to get there. So we need to start plotting our maneuver nodes for both the Tylo mothership and the Laythe mothership. Of course, I've already plotted the maneuver node for the Tylo ship. In fact, we are now executing the maneuver node burn. I really should pay more attention to what's happening on screen before I start saying things out loud. There goes that maneuver node there. Whoop, there we go. Vall encounters, Laythe encounters, and indeed Tylo encounters are all pretty easy to get once you're in the Julian system. It's Pol and Bop that tend to be a little bit more difficult because they have such small gravity wells. I mean, Tylo's gravity well is absolutely massive. I think the common fan theory is that Tylo is a captured planet because it is absolutely huge relative to the size of Jool. For a moon the size of Tylo, Jool should really be a lot bigger. and denser to produce a large and strong enough gravitational well. And, you know, it should have an atmosphere, really, something as massive as Tylo. So, all a bit mysterious is Tylo. Perhaps it warrants further study once we've concluded our Laythe expeditions. Let me know your thoughts of that down below. But for now, the chapter on Tylo has been closed. Now we need to do Vall, Pol, and Bop, which are not as difficult as Tylo and Laythe, but they do still present their own challenges nonetheless. And there is Vall there. You can't really get a good sense of what it looks like with the new texture revamp because this is just the map screen, but you guys will see in due course, I promise. We must now crossfade. Meanwhile, back at Laythe, Jebediah begins his odyssey to meet his friends in Vall orbit. So again, we're just going to create a couple of maneuver nodes to get our Vall encounter, and then we can just go ahead and execute that maneuver node burn. I feel like whenever I run out of things to talk about or have no real interesting things to bring to the table, I just start watching the screen and just say what is happening out loud. Like, here we are on the map screen, there is our orbital line, there are the separation nodes, and now we are not in the map screen, now we are time warping, and now we are around Jool, and etc, etc. This joke probably isn't very funny. This is what it's come to, guys. This is an hour long. I don't think I've ever done a Kerbal Space Program mission as long as this one, outside of stuff like Green Harvest and Into the Warp and stuff like that. I think I've done like a couple of tutorials like to Juno, which were quite long, but I don't think I've ever done a commentary as long as this. I mean, I'm definitely feeling the length, right? It's a Monday night and my room is getting quite toasty because I close the door and close the window when recording these commentaries, try and contain any sort of echo and vibration, and the walls of my office are covered in foam, and my PC runs very hot when I'm recording, and then the radiator in my office came on. I forgot to turn the radiator off, so that made it it's very hot and very warm, basically, guys. And, you know, I put on a bit of weight in 2020, okay? I've got a bit more insulation than I normally pack. I had a few issues, right? Back when lockdown started, I had no kitchen because I was getting my kitchen done up, right? And then they came along, ripped everything out, removed the walls, disconnected everything, and then lockdown in the United Kingdom happened, and then they couldn't come for like 3 months. And for those 3 months, I had a kettle and a microwave, and I live in a city, so all the takeaways are near me. So, you know, guys, I'm only human, you know. I look at my cupboard of pot noodles, and then I look at my phone and see that Devon Kebab, Pizza and Grill, you know, a true establishment of Plymouth, are delivering for free. You know, you put two and two together. There's only one way this story ends. It's not good for my BMI. But that's now over, that little ordeal. I now have a kitchen again. I feel like something else happened as well. What else happened? Oh yeah, that's right, my fridge broke. Like, literally, I can't believe the timing, okay? So then we had a second lockdown in the UK in winter, and literally that week, my fridge died. So then I had no fridge. So again, I'm faced with dry foods that I have to cook after a long day of work, and then subsequently long hours making YouTube stuff. Or again, I look at Justy on my phone, see that, you know, one of the many great Plymouth establishments is delivering, and you know, it kind of all falls apart. So yeah, I got some work to do. Got some work to do in 2021. Hopefully nothing else goes wrong with my kitchen and cooking situation, but hopefully that's the end of it now. I've paid the piper. I'm ready to like go back to, you know, having a normal life again. And there I'm probably speaking on behalf of a lot of people in 2020. Now I say that out loud. Anyway, oh my goodness, here we are at Vall. I spent ages hyping it up, and then when the time came, I was talking about getting deliveries on my phone. Look at that. Isn't it so cool? It looks like, I don't know if this was the intention, but it looks very icy. Like, I'm guessing this is meant to look like Europa, which is Jupiter moon, right? Europa, it's a moon of Jupiter. I'm like really putting myself on the spot here. I think it's a Jupiter moon. It's got a very icy surface. There's like a frozen ocean. I was about to say there's a frozen ocean underneath the ice. There is a liquid ocean underneath the frozen ice. Very, very interesting stuff. And the Europa Clipper was in the news recently, actually, because that's getting ready to launch in, and again, I'm putting myself on the spot, 2024, I think, and legally, it has to launch on an SLS. That's like written into law, can't be changed, which is like looking dumb basically now, because the SLS is very, very delayed, and the Europa Clipper launch is not one of the priority launches. So now it's like, will the Europa Clipper fly? So now it's actually been passed that perhaps that law can be changed and it can be flown on the Falcon Heavy or something similar. I think the Falcon Heavy is the best alternative to SLS, so I don't know if that's been actioned yet. I think Congress has to do something, or the Senate has to do something. I'm not really sure how American politics works. But, you know, it's now might not necessarily have to launch on an SLS, which is good news for the Europa Clipper mission, because that mission I am really, really excited for. So, yeah, I don't really know how that affects SLS, though, because wasn't the Europa Clipper part of the crew validation, like, launches? I don't know. I haven't researched this. This is all kind of improv. We're nearly 40 minutes into my commentary. Most of my commentaries will be over by now, so I'm just slowly descending into madness when I think of the prospect that we still got 3 landings left to do. But we're about to do one of them, so really it's only like 2.5, maybe, because we don't have to do a journey to anywhere. Now we're captured around Vall. Anyway, now we can get our lander ready to perform our landing. Now, we've got a lot of dead weight in this craft, right? We're no longer having to push around the massive mass that we had to when we left Kerbin, so we don't really need 4 nuclear engines anymore, and we've depleted enough of our fuel that all of the fuel on board this thing can be moved to the front ship, like the one that went to Laythe, which means that once we've completed our Vall mission, we can actually ditch the posterior aspect of this craft and get ourselves a little bit more Delta V by ditching all of that dead weight. And that's why the rear part of the ship has a probe core, not necessarily because it would have helped us when we went to Tylo, because of course it did help massively when we went to Tylo, but it would be really useful because we can have that component deorbit itself once we're done with it, which we pretty much are. Still got to do our Vall landing, or at least the rest of our Vall landing, and you know, in terms of landing on Vall, it's not something to be completely trifled with. It is a bit harder than the Mun. I believe it takes about 900 meters per second of Delta V to do a Vall landing, and then another 900 meters per second to do a Vall ascent, which is about the same as Moho, so you do need a fair old amount of Delta V, but we have that in this ship, so it was fine, and then we can run all of our science experiments once we're on the surface, because again, I said from the beginning that the objective of this mission was to get maximum science, and speaking of science, let's, I thought I was going to do my EVA experiment, and that would have lined up with the commentary really well. Oh, I think I now, this is the point where I discovered the lower visor thing. And there we are. We're doing the banana experiment again. I don't know if this is true, or like if this is the case, but I think it's that if you're on a planet or moon with no atmosphere, then the Kerbal will do the smash the banana experiment when you do the EVA science. And then if you're on an atmospheric planet like Kerbin or Laythe, then they'll do the golf shot. I don't actually know if that's the case, but that's my theory based on what I've learned from this mission. Okay, so we have now re-embarked the Vall lander. So now it's time to close all the doors. Oh, yeah, no, so I was going to say we got some science from an ice chunk, I think it was, which is a surface feature that comes with the Breaking Ground DLC. And as we take off from Vall, we can put another little tick on our list of places to go. 3 moons down, only 2 to go. And the last 2 moons are Pol and Bop, which are much, much easier to land on than Vall, Tylo, and Laythe. But they do have their own caveat in that they're much harder to get to. Not only are their spheres of influence much smaller than the 3 moons we've done so far, so it's much harder to get encounters with them, but Bop is particularly difficult to reach because it's on a very tilted orbit relative to its neighbours. So we're going to have to do a fairly expensive orbital inclination adjustment to get an encounter with Bop. So it takes a bit more Delta V than you might think to get to Pol and Bop, particularly Bop. But right now, this is all something to consider in just a second. Right now, we need to complete the Vall phase of this mission, which is rendezvousing with the mothership. Overshot our encounter a little bit, but wasn't a big deal. And with the power of video editing, I can just speed the footage up nice and fast so that it doesn't end up wasting too much time for you guys. How are you guys doing, by the way? I feel like this is a very one-sided conversation, right? How was your day? How's your day been? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Can't actually hear you, by the way. I lied. This is all very much... This is just a video, right? No idea what to say, really. I think a lot of us are experiencing a bit of lockdown fever, right? Things are going a bit crazy at home sometimes. Although, you know, I'm in a pretty nice place in the world, right? I've got Plymouth, so I've got the sea near me. I've got a fairly nice living situation. I've got a small garden, so I've got somewhere to go out and places like that. And there's a big park right outside my house, so I can go for nice long walks, and it's not too isolating. I mean, it could be worse, guys. I could literally be living in Crewe which is one of the most depressing cities I've ever been to. We went to, so my girlfriend Beth, we went to her aunt's birthday, I think it was. I really hope she doesn't watch these videos, by the way, but I think we went to one of her aunt's birthdays or something, and that was in Macclesfield. So Beth booked us a hotel in Crewe, which is like the next town over, and it's like, imagine just sadness personified as a town. That's Crewe. I'm very sorry if any of you live in Crewe. Not because I'm sorry if I'm offending you, I'm just sorry that you live in Crewe, because my goodness, what a depressing town. We literally walked around the town centre on the first day we were in the hotel for, decided that being outside in Crewe is terrible, went back to the hotel, and then spent the rest of the weekend, except for the small portion of time where we were in Macclesfield for the party, just in the hotel room. Luckily, I'd brought my external hard drive with me, and the hotel room TV accepted USB ports. We literally just binge-watched Futurama for an entire day in the hotel rather than going out into Crewe, which, I don't know. I'm very sorry if I'm offending anyone right now, but your town sucks. I'm very sorry. I have stayed in worse accommodation, though. I feel like, I don't know, have I told the story about my London flat? I feel like at this point there are enough new viewers of the channel that I could just tell this story again, so I deeply apologise. You can put some music on if you don't want to hear this story again. But like, I feel like I've exhausted all the things I can talk about with this particular mission, because it's the same thing 5 times, effectively, right? 5 different moons. But no, when I was a student, when I was a young lad, this would have been 2014, I believe. When I was a student, one of the things I have to do, or had to do, I should say, because it's past tense, thank goodness. Yeah, one of the things we had to do was spend 9 months on clinical placement at various ophthalmology departments across the country, just to, you know, get some clinical experience. That's just one of the requirements of my regulatory body for me to practice in eyes. That's my actual job title, just eyes. Captain Eyes, actually, to you. But yeah, we had to stay in accommodation at all of these sites, because sometimes they would be on the opposite side of the country to where you live. So in this case, I was deployed to the Royal London Hospital, which is in Whitechapel, which is in East London, and it's the specific part of London where Jack the Ripper operated. So, you know, you can interpret that however you want. And, you know, it's a little run down. So I had to bring a month's worth of supplies with me, because I was staying at the hospital for a month. So I had a big suitcase with me. I got out of the train at Whitechapel station, and there's no escalators there. So I had to drag my suitcase up some stairs to get out of the station. I emerged through the turnstiles onto the street in Whitechapel and was met with this giant abandoned building, like right opposite the station. It was huge, and it had the words Royal London Hospital on top of it. It turned out that was the old hospital that was like a listed building, so they couldn't knock it down, but it was no longer fit for purpose, so it wasn't in use. So it was effectively like just this big derelict building right opposite the train station. So I had to kind of go through this alleyway in between 2 flanges of the building to get to the new hospital. Then once I was there, I was like, okay, this hospital, now I've gone through the abandoned nightmare bit, is quite nice. It's a big swanky building. It's a huge building, in fact, absolutely colossal. So I thought, okay, let's go to the security desk, because usually when you're staying in the clinical accommodation, you go to the security desk because it's the security guards that have all of the keys. So I went to the desk and I was like, hello, I am Matt Lowne and I am a student here to pick up my keys. And it was like, oh yeah, here you go, here's the envelope. It just had the the numbers 616, which some people believe to be the true devil's number. Again, you can interpret that however you want. I thought, cool, where are the flats? And then he just gestured toward a glass door, which opened up into a very dark, unlit street. Bear in mind, this is like 9 p.m. in winter in like East London at this point, and I was there with my big coat, my headphones on from traveling, and my big suitcase. I'm like, oh, cool. So it's just at the beginning of that street, right? Like right outside this door. And he goes, no, it's at the other end of that street. So I'm like, okay, cool. So walking down this street, looks a little bit sketchy. Looks a little bit sketch. There was this silver Mercedes that was parked halfway up this pedestrianized street with its lights on, and there was just 3 like men. No, it was 4 men just sitting inside the silver Mercedes with the interior light on and the headlights on as well with the engine running. And they were just sitting there in silence, not talking. I was like, oh, okay. That's cool. Apparently this was like a drug dealing spot, I later found out, so I guess they were there for that, maybe. I don't know. I don't pass judgment. But then I got to the end of this street. And I said earlier that, you know, Crew is like the personification of sadness as a town. This was like the personification of sadness as a building. It was the most tired looking building ever. It just looked sleepy and sad, and all the lights were off. It looked abandoned. So I went up to the door and I opened my envelope, and there was like a key and a card that you use to access buildings, like a fob card. So anyway, I take this card and walk up the steps, dragging my suitcase behind me, and I get to this door, and it looks like a repurposed bank vault door. Like, it is just this solid metal, no window thing. I'm like, okay. I just touched my card against the fob reader and went click, and then just like opened a bit, and I had to sort of like help it open a bit. Like, I opened it, and inside, and I know skeptics are going to think that I'm just exaggerating for comedic effect, but I promise you this description is spot on. It looked like some horror film location. Like, it was like yellow fluorescent lights with like ceiling tiles, with half of the ceiling tiles either broken or just missing. Old, tired, yellowed carpeting with yellowed walls as well. There was a vending machine that was just on its side, you know, but it was like turned on as well, so clearly it's maintained, so I don't know why it's on its side. And then there were like 2 lifts opposite me, but they were really narrow lift doors. I don't know why that detail is important, but they were really narrow lift doors. I'm like, okay, so my envelope with my keys in it says 616, so usually what that would mean is that it's flat 16 on room 6. That was how I interpreted it anyway. So I called the lift, sat there and waited, and then it sort of said, it went ping, and then the door opened like a fraction and then just sort of stopped opening. I'm like, is this, do I have to help it now? So I had to sort of put my hand on the lift door and pushed it to get it to open the rest of the way, got into the lift, closed the door, and then pressed floor 6. And again, I had to sort of place my hands on the door to get it to close properly. And then the whole thing started to rumble like the space shuttle on re-entry as it jankily ascended up the building. It said floor 6 and stopped. And then it didn't do anything. And I'm like, okay, so clearly if the lift doors aren't going to open, I'm just going to die in here. So I'm like, okay, I can't get this to open. Even like I pressed my hand against the door again and tried to slide it. It didn't move. I'm like, okay, we know it opens on floor 1, right? So let's try floor 7. So I press 7, it goes floor 7. After, you know, a whole commotion of rumbling and ascension like a rocket on takeoff, gets to floor 7, ping, lift door opens. I had to help it open, but it opened nonetheless. I'm like, okay, cool. Turned out that this lift worked on every single floor except floor 6. So every day I had to get the lift up to floor 5 or 7 and then use the fire escape to get down to level 6. And the fire escape, it's not like an external fire escape, but it was like a bare concrete fire escape that was kind of like separate from the building. So it was kind of cold. I kind of had to drag my suitcase down the concrete steps, and the wheel broke as well, which was great. Get to my room, finally. Room 16. And I open it. Now, it is just a room. Like, there are like communal bathrooms, which I'll get to in a second. But I open the room, and immediately I'm met with the curtains are billowing, and it's freezing cold. I'm like, okay, well, clearly some numpty has left the window open, so I'll go and close it. Wrong. The windows are actually just bolted like that. So they're the kind of windows that you get in offices where they slide down to open. But this has been slid down and then bolted like that. So literally it was just always open. I remember the next day I went to the nearest Sainsbury's, which is like a supermarket in the UK, and bought loads and loads of toilet paper. Those are the days, right? Pre-2020. And I bought loads of toilet paper and duct tape and just stuffed that gap with toilet paper and then sealed it shut with the duct tape just to keep the room at a tolerable temperature. Like, it wasn't completely freezing cold, which wouldn't have been so much of an issue if I had a duvet on the bed. But this room did not come with a duvet on the bed. It came with a piece of what I can only imagine as tissue paper that just sort of described itself as a duvet, as a ruse. I don't know if it was cheaper or what, but this duvet was terrible. It was a thin little sheet, and that was it. It was terrible. And I had one pillow that was very flat. It was just not a very comfortable sleeping situation. And it gets worse, really. This is all kind of good stuff so far. I mean, it's a bed, there was a basic amenity there. There was a desk, which I could put my laptop on and play some Kerbal Space Program. By the way, this is how I became, this sounds really arrogant, but this is how I became, in air quotes, so good at Kerbal Space Program, because on these placements, there would very rarely be internet. It would never, ever be good internet. So I'd often just play offline Steam games, and KSP doesn't have any DRM, so it would always work on internetless sites. So I basically had Kerbal Space Program and some pirated TV shows that I could watch in the absence of a internet connection. I take no shame in that, I was paying for Netflix, so technically I had access to all of these shows, just not any internet connection on which I could watch them. Anyway, yes, I thought, well, we got to bed, I'm going to have a shower. Oh, what a fool I was. There were no showers. So it was like, it was like a bathroom for every 2 rooms. So every sort of along the corridor where all the flats were, there'll be these archways with 3 doors through the archway. So when you go through the archway, there's a door right in front of you, and then a door to the left and to the right. Left and right are the 2 bedrooms. The one right in front of you is the communal bathroom for the 2 rooms. But the bathroom would have a toilet, a sink, and then a bathtub with no plug in it either. So it was basically just like a big sink, effectively. And it was like, it somehow looked older than the building it was sitting in. It was like murky yellow color, and it was just like, it was like the perimeter of the top of the bathtub. I'm just starting to get my words out because I'm trying to visualize what this looked like. The perimeter of the top of the bathtub was kind of like yellowy yellow, basically. And then as you got down towards the basin, it would just become like this grey color where it all just like worn away and was just sort of grimy. And that was the bath. And there was no shower head or anything. I was told by some of the people also living in this flat that the cleaners would take away the shower heads if people bought showers, because you can get shower heads that attach to taps. Have you guys ever seen them? You can get like special shower head adapters that you can put onto the end of a tap to shower in a bathtub that doesn't have a shower. But apparently the cleaners would just take those away because they were unhygienic, apparently. So I remember every morning I would have to sit in my bathtub with a saucepan running the taps and just letting the saucepan fill up for a bit, and then I just poured water over myself. And if that wasn't depressing enough, the saucepan I'd brought on placement with me, because a lot of the times the kitchens don't have, pans and stuff, so you have to use your own. So I'd brought this saucepan with me. And I didn't bring any sponges with me either, because normally when I'm in the shower I don't use a sponge, right? I just put a bit of shower gel on my hand and just rub it, I just rub it using my hand. But because I'm kind of like in a bathtub pouring water over myself with a pan, I had to use like some sort of sponge or a flannel. So I used a dishcloth. And I brought like a pack of dishcloths with me that obviously I intended to use to wash dishes, but I had to use one of them just to clean myself in the morning. And then kind of disgustingly, a couple of weeks later, I found a plug in one of the bathrooms. It wasn't on a chain, so I could claim the plug. I put it in my bathtub, I filled it up, and that's when I realized that the water was yellow. It wasn't transparent. So that was a nice discovery to make 3 weeks into my placement, that, oh, this water isn't water, apparently. It's yellow. Let's not think about what it might have been. I mean, it didn't smell that bad. And no one ever commented telling me that I smell bad, so hopefully it was just some weird additive in the water. It was nothing to worry about too much. What else was there? Oh yeah, the kitchen itself, it was pretty terrible. It was like an old oven that didn't really work. I remember the first time I turned it on, it just set fire to itself. There was like tin foil underneath the hob rings, and I guess there was food on the tin foil, and it just torched that. So that was a bit of a scary thing that happened. The fridges were really tiny for like Americans out there, because I think in America it's pretty standard to just have gigantic fridges, but in the UK a lot of the time fridges are quite small, like they're just the size of a normal cupboard, and it was fridges like that. So you have the fridge, which is like a normal cupboard size, and then the very top shelf is like the freezer drawer, and the freezer drawer in this place was just literally a solid block of ice that you couldn't put anything in the freezer, basically. So yes, that was lots of fun. So then it came to Saturday, and I decided it was time to do some laundry. So I got in the lift that didn't really work that well and went all the way down to the basement. And the door opened, and the basement was like very basement-y. I know that sounds kind of weird to say, but it was like concrete floor, concrete walls, flickery lights, horror film setting, etc., etc. I walked along with my like rucksack that I'd stuffed all my washing into, got to the laundry room, and literally it was so weird when I went in because there was like 3 wooden ladders that were suspended from the ceiling that people would just hang their clothes from. That was the drying solution. And there was just 2 really manky looking washing machines. You had to put money in as well. So I put my washing powder in the washing powder drawer, put my clothes in, put my money in, pressed like go, and it just sort of went, and like a little bit of water trickled onto my clothes. I was just watching through the glass door, and then all of my powder just went poof. It just dumped all the powder on the top of the pile of clothes, and then the drum, rather than, rotating like a washing machine does, it sort of went and just sort of oscillated a little bit side to side, and that was literally it. It didn't do anything. I was like, okay, maybe it's just a slow start. I'm just going to go away for a bit because it's got like 2 hours left on the cycle, and we'll make an assessment when it's done. 2 hours later, I come back and I open the door, and literally there is still just a pile of powder on top of one of my shirts that was at the top of the pile, and everything else is bone dry, except the very bottom, which is now a bit stinky because it just had that little bit of water that was added at the very beginning, and then that water just sat there for 2 hours soaking into all the clothes. Luckily, my uncle and my cousin live in London, and they have like a normal home with a washing machine that works. So I just sort of phoned him. I was like, Uncle Chris, can I come and use your washing machine, please? So I was able to get my washing done, but that was a real nightmare. So, and I think my cousin watches these videos from time to time as well. Hello, Dan, if you're watching this video. Oh my goodness, I've just looked back at the screen and it's done. Well, there we go. Did I have anything to talk about with Pol and Bop? I don't think so. We got our science count just there. I mean, what else was there in this flat? I remember, like, I found out that it was only every other floor in this block of flats that had the flats. The other ones were offices used by the medical school. And one of the floors, in fact, floor 7, directly above me, had loads of anatomical, like, things preserved in formaldehyde, like a tongue in a jar, just in one of the offices, which was nice to find. Anyway, there's things on screen if you want to click those. After that great commentary, buy my merch, bye.